Welcome to round 3 of the Formula 1 World Championship at the Australian Grand Prix. It's Perez in the pit lane. Lewis Hamilton is in the top 6 for the first time this season. And on the front row, George Russell and Max Verstappen. Good reaction time for George Russell, putting the pressure on Max Verstappen. Russell to the inside, Russell to the lead of the Grand Prix. What a start from Russell. And Hamilton to the inside of Verstappen. They're nearly banging wheels. In the background goes Charles Leclerc into the gravel trap.
Charles was too greedy there.
Hamilton close, forcing a defensive shape from Russell.
You're asking me to manage and I'm being attacked by my own teammate.
Albert off the road, gravel all over the circuit, safety car deployed. Russell has pitted from the lead, so Mercedes see track position, a red flag.
It's a stinker for Russell.
Yeah, sorry George, that screwed us.
Are you up, guys?
And we're racing once again.
This is going to be the chance.
Around the outside goes Max Verstappen.
See you later.
There's nothing Hamilton can do. Max Verstappen, Lord class.
Nah, forget it.
Whoa, to the inside. He's done it again, Sergio Perez.
You, bye-bye.
That's a major failure. If he keeps making passes there, they're going to have to name it after him. That Red Bull is a rocket ship.
It's a delightful overtakes in this race.
That's Magnussen.
He hit a wall.
Red flag. What?
What a moment in Melbourne. It's actually worked from the top 3. And Fernando Alonso is spot right. Perez is off the road. And there's a crash in the back of the field. Into the wall goes Gasly. And it's absolute chaos on the restart.
Because we don't complete a lap, we go back to the same positions.
So we have 5 seconds penalty.
No, it cannot be. It is unacceptable. They need to wait until the race is finished and discuss with me.
Safety car will head to the pit lane, just take the checkered flag. There is no overtaking.
Max Verstappen wins the Australian Grand Prix.
Welcome to the ESPN Post-Race Show. We were down under in Melbourne. Well, none of us were, but we were watching the race in Melbourne, the Australian Grand Prix. Welcome. It's me, Liz Loza, and I'm joined by Nate Saunders along with Spencer Hall. Okay, this was a wild race. We ended up with the podium as Max Verstappen, Lewis Hamilton, and Fernando Alonso, but we were on a journey to get there, gentlemen. Give me your immediate takeaways from what we just witnessed.
Well, I'm starting to think that any podium involving Fernando Alonso can't be straightforward anymore. You know, we had the Saudi one, we had this one today. Kind of difficult to understand what was going on at points. Quite frustrating at points as well. And this is one of the races I spent the most time reading about afterwards, just what on earth happened to understand why everyone got there. So a mixture of emotions, like you said, Liz. It was kind of a roller coaster from start to finish.
Yeah, you know,
Spencer, what was your takeaway? Yeah.
I was gonna say, you know, it's a great race when you need notes and a study guide afterwards to figure out exactly what happened, because you can't tell in real time. My favorite race of the year so far, but that's not necessarily a good thing for the overall quality of the racing. Dramatic.
It was weird. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was like the start was great, the end was super dramatic, and then there was that weird bit in the middle where I was like, am I just watching a repeat of the same lap over and over again? Because it was pretty tedious. So weird, bookended by 2 really kind of cool bits to the race. But yeah, overall it was a bit of a strange one.
Well, Nate, you were a little bit underwhelmed by Jeddah. So how did Australia compare?
Yeah, I think it was. I mean, the start was fantastic. I think anytime someone takes the fight to Max, like George and Lewis did, you know, we're all for that now because we don't get to see much of it. I thought, I don't know, it was such a shame the timing of the first red flag, because I think we had a really interesting scenario playing out in front with George pitting when he did, Lewis not pitting, Max staying out as well, and then it kind of it didn't take Max long to get through. So that red flag kind of weirdly, I think, stopped the drama early. And then, the red flag that we had later kind of hit the reset button on the drama and just said, hey, everything goes out the window now. None of us know what's going on. So, yeah, very strange. I think it's the first race ever with 3 red flags in it. So, one for the history books. But I think that just added to how little you could kind of gauge what was going on at the end, because I think I really respected David Croft and Jensen Button on the world feed. Like the way they were kind of explaining it as they went, I felt like I was back in school again with a teacher who wasn't quite sure if the notes they have on the lesson were correct, but they were teaching you about them and you're like, I think I get what's going on. They were doing a pretty good job of it. But again, like Spencer said, when you've got to make notes, when you've got to have those kind of things talk you through, something kind of weird has happened.
Well, I think that was the first. Let's talk about that first red flag / safety car situation. It happened to Alex Albon, who was having a wonderful weekend. He was such a star for so much of the time in Melbourne, but not so lucky sevens after all. Flies into the gravel in turn 7 on lap 7, and that draws the safety car, and then ultimately the red flag. Spencer, were you surprised that the red flag was called there?
I was. I'm not surprised for the second one, but the first one I was, because it just seemed like an off. It seemed like an off. Like, okay, good, get the car moving. So that seemed a little strange. Every single interruption in this race seemed strange. It really did. Yeah. Like Kevin Magnussen hitting the wall, where he did and how he did. Even at the time, again, this is where I thought, Nate, you're totally right. Croft and Button were giving a master class in driver and viewer education, because they're sitting there going, we don't know what happened, right? That humility of going, hey, we need a minute. This is kind of chaotic. So I was surprised at the first one. I was surprised at the timing of how everything happened to keep the race tight. It felt, and this is not an insult, it felt like a NASCAR race. Because in NASCAR, sometimes you'll see long periods of tedium interrupted by total chaos, right? Yeah. No consistent performance. Just, okay, cool, you've been great for 30 laps. We're going to undo all of that by calling a red flag, doing a restart, and getting everyone going again. So I was surprised at pretty much everything in this race. Like, I was even surprised at the tedium in the middle, because that's where I thought drivers were going to set up. That's where I thought Alonso would make a move. That's where I thought people would start hunting people down. You could hear on the radio, right? Again, shouts out to the broadcast crew for doing a great job, because they would come in with these little radio bits of like, okay, we're going to press him, right? Like Alonso's going to press Hamilton. And then Hamilton came over, and then Hamilton's crew came over and was like, okay, Alonso's going to press you, right? And then the broadcaster jumped back in, and they were like, they do this all the time. This isn't weird. Don't freak out. So like, this was, to me, a challenge for everyone, including the viewers, that I thought, drivers did well, crews did well, even the broadcast did well. So is it the best race you'll ever see? No. Was it fascinating top to bottom? Yeah, I thought it was really interesting.
Nate, to Spencer's point, he was talking about how Alonso and Hamilton were in this fight for P2 and P3. But then I was a little bit surprised when the second red flag was called at the reaction of both Hamilton and Alonso. I thought that they were going to be not so disappointed, right? That Alonso, there was all this talk about being on the hards, and are the hards, and Lewis was like, I don't think these tires are going to last, mate, right? Like all of this presupposed drama and potential friction and a potential showdown. And then they were like, what? We were kind of happy to like just end 2 and 3. Nate, were you surprised that those two drivers specifically, given their competitive nature and their history, were like, nah, we were ready to like call it?
Yeah, that's a really good point, Liz, because Alonso's message, he was like, I can't believe they've done this, wasn't he? Basically, like, what on earth is going on? I think it shows you with those two guys that I think they understand as much as anyone the high stakes, like how much there is to lose. If you're out in the front there, exactly as Alonso nearly found out, all it takes is one clumsy moment from a driver near you, and suddenly a whole race, for Lewis, if you think about where he was, he felt like he was clinging on to second place. I mean, I love that Lewis perpetually thinks his tires are just about to explode. I love that about him. Like every single race, they could have just gone on. He's like, these aren't going to get to the end of the race. So he's suddenly being told there's a red flag. In his head, you're thinking, I mean, Lewis has been in these situations time and time again. Obviously 21 in Abu Dhabi, lost the championship because of a crash elsewhere, etc. So I think their minds just go to the absolute worst scenario. I think they think we're not going to catch Max, even at a restart. He'll get away from us. So it's in their heads then, it's only, well, all we can do is lose what we've gained so far rather than gain. But I think you're right. It was fascinating to see the insight of two of those guys going to the worst place rather than maybe I can win this race now. Because, I didn't think Alonso especially would be like that. I thought he'd be like, this is amazing. We can win the race now. Instead, he was kind of like, oh, no, like as if he'd given up the podium there and then. He thought we're not going to get it now. So, yeah, very strange.
And he ended up being quite relieved after all, right?
Yeah. I mean, probably the luckiest guy in the last few laps. And we haven't been able to say that about Fernando Alonso, historically in his career. So maybe some luck coming back to him. But what I thought was really interesting, and it's so funny Spencer said about NASCAR, because I had that written down here. I was like, that had NASCAR all over it. And I think Fernando Alonso is one of the guys who has said that F1 is overregulated, that there's a lot of things happening, where he doesn't like that the spectacle kind of takes precedent over, logical decisions and stuff like that. Did feel a little bit like that was what he was thinking, I think. And his message when he briefly had crashed out and had lost that podium was exactly that, wasn't it? It was, this is what happens when we start a race just for the show, etc. So there was a momentary frustration, and then he suddenly realized, okay, I'm back. And there's a great shot of him outside the car in the pit lane. Kind of, I think he'd just been told, okay, you are going to start again in third. You should finish third. You could see he still wasn't 100% sure if he could be okay with that yet. He was like, okay, until I'm in the car, until I'm back in that position, I'm not going to be happy with it. So I think he really went through the mill with his emotions at the end.
We all did. It was a journey. Like I said, Spencer, do you think ultimately that this was the right way to end the race?
I have a controversial opinion, which is that there's no real good way.
Oh, we love these. We love these.
There's no real good way to end a sporting event. This is one of debates about this in every sport are controversial. How do we end a season? How do we end a game? What is overtime? How do we determine the winner of a contest, right? Our shootouts, our penalty shootouts in soccer, fair or unfair? Is a restart at the end of a race fair or unfair? None of them are fair, right? None of on the long frame, none of them are fair. The fairest thing would be we have 60 laps, go race it. But it would also have had an incredibly stupid result. It would have had a result that depended on a fist fight on the last lap. If you race, because this has happened before. If you say whoever finishes the F1 race first, that's who wins, no matter what happens on the final laps. When you're this close and you've established this kind of restart, you're begging for this kind of nonsense, right? So do I think it was a fair way to end the race? Yeah, given all the crap that happened on the last lap, it was fair. Or how's this? It was the least unfair result they could have given. Right. And that includes the penalty. That includes the penalty to Carlos Sainz. If you say, hey, was that a justified penalty given to Carlos Sainz? I would say it was the most justifiable penalty. It was the one that they had to give. It was the one they should have given. No one wants that to happen. Right. Like, I don't think any of us are sitting in the position as fans, and when we look to discuss the sport, we don't say you're a judge. Go be a judge. Go say go say that this person deserved a penalty. No, I don't want to give Carl. Did you hear him? He sounded in pain. He sounded in actual pain. Like his brain broke for a moment when he got that penalty. But sometimes that's just how you have to end things. That's how, especially when you're dealing with sport where actual hazard is at play, as this is, and where there was already some chaos. If you want to have some kind of, retrofitted, hindsight equipped justification for ending this race early, there were fans on the track.
Yeah,
there were, this is in the hours after the race. Again, Nate, study guide. We need a study guide to understand everything that happened here. But guys, there were people on the track. Again, for some reason, the race stewards summoned the organizers of the Australian GP to their offices following the race because someone got to Hulkenberg's car in turn 2 after on the final lap. That's bonkers. But that's another reason that at the end of a race where everything has already gone sideways, you might just want to go ahead, be sensible, and wrap it up.
And end it. I am hearing a tinge of American, we don't like ties here.
Correct.
Right. There's a bit of that, no, we like to have a black and a white finish ending. But you mentioned study guide again. And I've heard that. We've used that phrase a couple of times. Nate, as someone who has worked in the space for such a long time and has acknowledged the growing fan base, what type of finish do you think this was for new fans? I mean, I will say myself, I was tweeting, I just want to know the rules. I just want to know the rules so that I can follow them, so that I can stay ahead of what's going to happen. So from your perspective, I mean, I think Spencer and I kind of know what we felt about it, but from your perspective as someone who has traveled all over the world, watching this and then knowing that in the back of your head, how do you think it was handled?
Yeah, I agree with everything Spencer said, by the way. I think that he summed it up perfectly. And just him saying penalty kicks as an Englishman made me shudder, completely because I hate them. No, it's cool, man. I mean, I've just got to live with it. That's how it is. But Spencer was completely right. This was the right way to finish the race. But I think the biggest issue isn't so much the rules. It's the communication we get from the FIA. And it's the fact that it's so difficult to explain, and Spencer did a great job with it there. I think one of the issues was, like we said, you've got two commentators, one of whom's a former world champion, kind of struggling to explain it. You have drivers walking around looking like, what on earth's going on? You're like, okay, so Max has won it, has he? And one of the weird things I thought, because it even confused me for a second, the FIA said they're going to go back to the grid and they're going to restart. And I thought, well, what? As a racing Are they going to restart and race again because there's not enough laps left? So even in the message the FIA put out, that was unclear. It was clear as mud, as they say. I was thinking, this is really simple to explain. It needs somebody just to write out and say, they're going to go back to the grid, they're going to do a formation lap, and Max will win under those conditions. Super simple, super straightforward. No one did that. So I think that's an easy takeaway from this, is that they need to improve the communication, improve everything around it. And yeah, I think for new fans, I mean, it's fascinating because now we've had 2 races where there's been all kinds of silliness after it. And I do wonder about what fans make of it. Obviously Netflix has done a fantastic job of showing some of the real drama, some of the some of it is manufactured, but the drama between people in racing. I think one thing it hasn't really covered a lot, because it didn't really go into huge detail about Abu Dhabi 21 or a lot of other things. It hasn't really covered how many times we're in these kind of situations where there's a weird rule, it's not really clear how it's played out. I know somebody who was actually at the race, and I messaged them saying, "Oh, what did you make of the end?" He said, "We had no idea what was going on. We had absolutely no idea. We're sitting in the grandstand. We didn't know what was going on. They went out again, and we were like, oh, we're going to get a race restart," and then they finished it, under the checkered flag. So I think that part of it, more than anything, has to improve. I think that F1's rulebook is what it is. It has to have these things in it. So I think that the main thing for me is that they just need to make a better deal of communicating it, whether it's through graphics, whether it's through, just something on the screen. Because even when they're going back out, I was like, okay, just to double check. I text my colleague, I text Lawrence. I was like, just to double check, they're not restarting the race, are they? Like, I wasn't even sure myself, and it was because what we had just hadn't really made that clear. So hopefully new fans haven't judged it based on that. A bad timing for it, because I think a lot of new fans are probably tuning in thinking, well, Max is just winning everything. If that plus a really messy finish, I hope that hasn't turned people off, because we all know F1's much, much better than that was today in terms of, how entertaining it can be and stuff like that.
I have a question for both of you based on that. Nate and Liz, is it 2021 forever? Like, are we just in Abu Dhabi 2021 forever when it comes to how FIA manages a race? Because they seem very gun shy and indecisive at the worst moments.
Well, that is, when I was texting with producer Dave about the show outline as the race was unfolding, I was like, this is giving 2021 vibes. This isn't a make good. It can't be a make good because Mercedes' car isn't good enough to make this a make good, right? But there does seem to be some weird payback situations. And I do think that's an excellent point, Spencer. Like, the lack of decisiveness, it's almost like, there was this bat signal sent out, and now there's a giant party happening. There's a huge rave and everybody's going to it. And then everyone's like, oh, wait, did anyone call the fire marshal to see what the capacity's like? And like, nobody knows, like, oh gosh, like, could the place burn down? We don't really know now. And so I think there has to be some internal conversations about, yes, communication, but also how we are, and there's some time before Azerbaijan, the next race. So we do have some space for this to be meted out, but there have to be some conversations if the goal is to maintain the new fan base that is so far flooding into the space.
Yeah, and what is clear as well is that the frustration felt on the Formula One side, so Domenicali and a lot of the teams with the FIA, that since Abu Dhabi has really grown and grown and grown. There's this frustration, not just about penalties and stuff. We had all the nonsense with the FIA president, a few months ago. Yeah. And you just get this sense that there was a bigger divide growing between the two. And I think Liz is right as well. I think that Abu Dhabi, if you're race director now, that has to be in the back of your head, even if you're not Michael Massey. The backlash that Massey got. He made a terrible mistake on that day from the perspective of his job, but some of the insults and some of the stuff he's dealt with since has been awful. So you wouldn't be human if you weren't worried about that as well. And I think, Spencer, what you said about them not being decisive, I think that is a really big thing. A lot of these things just need somebody to say, here's where we're at. And one name that always comes up is Charlie Whiting, who was obviously race director before Michael Massey. Died very, very sadly, ahead of an Australian Grand Prix a few years ago. He was so decisive with those things. He was like, boom, there's the decision. You talk to me afterwards if you don't like it. That was it. That was, game, set, match. You saw him afterwards. So it is lacking that authority, clearly.
Let's talk about the domino effects of all of this, because it wasn't just the fan base that was left confused. There were also teams who were completely taken out of the points. I'm talking about Alpine, who's been my scrappy little sleeper of a squad, right? Pierre Gasly was having the drive of, I don't want to say his career, but certainly of his career in the pinks. And that to fly into the wall and take out Ocon at the same time, not to mention what that does for their relationship, which, you know, was not necessarily the sweetest. There was certainly some repairing going on. Like that's gotta, and now Gasly also has like all of these penalties that are piling up. So let's start with Alpine first, Spencer, and like what you think that relationship might turn out to be, and if the red flag at the end kind of really did that squad dirty.
I think they were an accomplice to being done dirty by that red flag and played into that very well. They took the bait. I think that sometimes it helps in a race team if one driver is clearly a whole standard deviation better than the other. That was my thinking. When you see two teammates take each other out, I'm like, that's a design problem. And it's one that you want to have because it means you have two excellent drivers who are pushing each other and who are on par with each other. It also means sometimes in the heat of battle, there won't be a clear 1-2. It really does. You know, like say what you will for Red Bull. They're managing a situation where they have two drivers who are a hair's breadth away from each other in terms of skill and output. And they're managing them very, very well when things could go very, very sideways. Given how tight things are in the middle of the pack right now. Like this was, to jump from that point to like another larger point while also answering your question, there's a lot of traffic in the middle right now. At one point in this race, we had 5 different teams in the top 5. 5 different ones going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's exceptional competition. That is not parity, but it is what you want to see, especially towards the middle of the pack. And when it gets tight between teams in the middle of the pack, if you have two drivers who are as close as Ocon and Gasly can be at times, they're going to be at each other's necks, whether they want to be or not. Whether we talk about them getting along, the numbers are just going to dictate. They're going to be right there. So clearly there's some communication that needs to happen there. I know Gasly apologized after the race. I think they're doing a good job managing that relationship, but they're real close, and this will happen again.
Yeah, and Ocon has previous with touching teammates in this way, doesn't he? So
yes, he does.
I think you're right. And I think it's a shame because I got the sense at the launch of their car when we went that Gasly and Ocon were actually in a pretty good place together. So you wonder, it only takes one of these incidents. And I wonder now, they've got 3 weeks to kind of stew over it as well. Sometimes, I've had a team boss tell me before that sometimes when your drivers collide, the best thing that can happen is you're back in the car racing 3 days later, 3-4 days later, because you can just get back in the car, you can get all the nonsense out of the way, talk to each other in the paddock and say, look, here's how it is. You get back in the car and things go on. You have 3 weeks to wait for it. You know, you've got drivers there sitting thinking about it, then maybe watching replays again. So it'll be interesting to see how that is when we get back to Baku.
Well, from one evenly matched team to another, let's talk about George Russell and Lewis Hamilton here. What an incredible start by George Russell. I mean, he started so brilliantly and ended just antithetical to that, right? Yeah. He passes all of this talk of Max, like not having the best reaction time from the start, a couple of times actually. George Russell gets ahead. Lewis is just behind him. There's a little bit of play. George saying, you know, I'm supposed to defend, but I'm getting attacked. And then he pits. And then we have the first red flag, and the strategy seems not as well intentioned or maybe not as wise after all. And then his car catches on fire and Lewis Hamilton ends up in P2. So Nate, take us on that journey and how this team navigates that relationship moving forward.
Yeah, it basically imploded, didn't it? From one moment, yeah. I mean, Russell, that pit stop, I think if the race had carried on without that red flag, Russell was in a really good position there. It is fascinating because I think, Spencer's right about when you have teammates that are super close together, this is a byproduct of that. And Russell has been so impressive since he joined Mercedes. I mean, he is so consistent. And I mean, I think on their day, I would probably still back Lewis to beat Russell just in a straight fight between them. But I think it's coming harder and harder to actually do that because every weekend we see Russell, take another step. He was great at the start, like you mentioned. And I feel like it's a ticking time bomb between those two. I think at some point we're going to have something, whether it's one of them stuck behind the other one and he's like, let me through, I'm faster, which we've seen other teams do. Mercedes currently haven't had to step in and actually manage that in that way yet. You know, I think with George and Lewis, there's clearly a lot of respect both ways there. You know, you can tell that when they talk about each other. So I don't expect it will go, you know, full on nuclear, full on, you know, fall apart of a relationship. But you do feel like there's something in there, you know, similar to whether it's a collision. And I never got that sense, for example, with Hamilton and Bottas, because I felt Hamilton was a clear step ahead of Bottas, and it was very unlikely they were going to come together. Russell has come into that team and he said, I'm as good as Lewis. And he's showing it on track, you know. So very interesting one. And especially as they get closer and closer to Red Bull, that's going to become harder and harder to manage, because obviously that's the quickest way as a team to lose points is have nonsense between your teammates, between your drivers. You know, that is the worst way to lose points, as Alpine found out today. So I think the Lewis George thing is going to play out, you know, in a really, really interesting way. Fair play to Lewis, though. You know, I think he did a good job kind of salvaging Mercedes' race after that incident. It was a shame we didn't get to see more Max and Lewis, because that's just box office whenever those two guys are together. I just wish I have a big box of popcorn next to me. But yeah, it's Mercedes. I think this is probably the best race they could have hoped for, bar the Russell retirement. There were so many positives coming out of the race that hopefully they're coming out of it and thinking that they're at least back on the right track. We'll see.
Spencer, what did you make of the strategy in which George pitted earlier? You know, Lewis came on the radio and said, you've left me to be a sitting duck now. Like, why did you guys do that? Now I can't defend. Obviously, the red flag changed all of that, but it was an interesting strategy. And I think Nate is right that these are two very evenly paced drivers. Obviously, the gap between their age and Lewis's contract doesn't make for fewer headlines or less tension between them. So why do you think that was the strategy that Mercedes was using, and how do you think it was received by Lewis?
Well, I'm going to put this as kindly as I possibly can, given the fact that he is a demigod of the sport at this point and one of the all-time greats. We are given the gift of Lewis Hamilton's open emotions over the mic every single week, and we get to hear him manage them in real time. I don't want to confuse that for him being insecure, because he certainly isn't. I don't want to confuse that for the team having to manage his emotions. He's done this his whole career, and he's very open about how he feels. That said, it's obvious to me that at every point Lewis is looking for either Russell in his mirror, and in any advantage given to Russell that isn't given to him, right? Whether that's perceived or whether that's real. I think he's the kind of guy who at every point is looking behind him and going, what do I have to do? What are you doing to help me? And sometimes when something goes Russell's way, I think he sees it as a zero-sum game, and he's not entirely wrong to see it that way. Mm-hmm. Am I being nice enough and circumspect about that? Talking around the thing where I go,
that you are being nice about it. The fact that you are being nice about it, what immediately comes to my mind is that we are not nice when Max does it. Max does it all the time. He is blatant about, towards the end of the race, the fastest lap was Checo. The broadcasting crew wasn't mentioning it. Checo has fastest lap. He's down in the order, right? I think at that point he was below Stroll, and Stroll was still at 6. And then Max has a fastest lap. You can tell that Max is looking to see whether or not Checo has the fastest lap. We saw that obviously in Jeddah, but that was something that was another plot line that was going on, the competition between those two drivers. And yet, and nobody was discussing it because there were so many other things to talk about. But when you were talking nicely about Lewis doing the same thing that competitors at the top of their game do, and that is what advances the sport and why we love it, then why do we not give Max the same pass?
Well, I just said it the real nice way. Let's say it the blunt way now. They can all be real petty. They can all be very petty all the time. And I get it, because the margins are so small at that point. And you all have to be divas, especially when you are considering, here is the team budget. I have to complain so that this much that goes to me becomes this much. That's it. I have to take every possible edge. I have to be both an attorney and I have to be my own motivational coach, right? At the same time. And when I say attorney, I refer to barrister Fernando Alonso, who, when coming around in that final lap, did the best job of both managing his own emotions, showing veteran savvy, and immediately going to the rule book, all in about 10 seconds. Utterly brilliant. He's going 140 miles an hour. He's instantly down to 0. And he goes, oh, That's cool. We're just going to go back to a restart, right? Okay, got it.
And he's just been spun around as well.
And he's just been spun around, and he's already in the rule book in his head going, no, that's cool. We got it. That's fine. But we get to hear this all in an open mic. Like F1 to me is a rare opportunity for the sports fan because we get to hear people in real time processing, right? I don't want to confuse that for weakness or insecurity. Okay. You give them a certain amount. Do we criticize Max Verstappen for this? Yes, but I have this slight note on why we do that. Max isn't real likable. Like Max is Max. Okay.
Yep.
That's a shark that drives a car. All he wants to do is win. Okay. Lewis Hamilton has some other factors he brings in personality wise in terms of both legacy, what he does off the track, who he is, his persona that I think gives him a little more credit. I really do. Verstappen just comes across as like little sharper, little more blunt, right? Not quite as likable. Now, this is, of course, from our perspective. The people who deal with Verstappen have a very different experience, right? He can be perfectly pleasant and isn't necessarily hostile. I think that's why. I just think it's like, I think we make a call based on the driver personality. Again, another thing we could do in F1 because we're right there in their heads. We're right there on the mic with them.
I just have to say that Spencer's analogies are chef's kiss. I mean, you compared, now it's Barrister Alonso, and before it was Maverick Fernando, which I love. These are perfect analogies. Nate, I'm sorry to interrupt. I just had to give Spencer some kudos, some snaps on that.
Yeah, no, I agreed. I think Barrister Alonso, I've been trying to think of a way to describe that. So that was perfect. Just a quick one on Alonso. On Hamilton from what Spencer said. It's interesting. I think people's perception of Lewis has improved in terms of his maybe petulance or pettiness since he stopped winning. And I think Max is now the guy who's winning. And when you're a bit petulant on the radio, when you're a bit, you're moaning on the radio and you're 10 seconds up the road, people go, shut up, man. Like, stop doing that. And I think we saw even with Vettel when he was doing that, I was a huge Schumacher fan growing up. When he was winning, if he was complaining, people just thought he was, he was just the worst person in the world. So I think there's a bit of that to it as well. But yeah, Barrister Alonso, that sounds like a Netflix show. That needs to happen.
Let's do
it. I don't know who the supporting cast would be, but Spencer, let's talk about that. We can pitch that idea to F1.
I'm in.
Let's bang the gavel for sure on that one. And also, just last point before we take a quick break. Have we all underestimated Mercedes' progress? I mean, a month ago, right? Everyone's like, oh no, what a disaster. Side pods this. Mike Elliott, what is he thinking? And now, well, I mean, other than George's car catching on fire, they ended up P2. With Lewis, so, it's been pretty fast. Nate, yeah.
Sorry, Liz, didn't mean to cut you off. I think, and to be honest, it's interesting looking back at conversations I was having in Bahrain with people when I was there in the paddock. Other teams, when they heard what Toto Wolff said after qualifying, were just like, "Come on, man, shut up! Like, it's not as bad as you're making out." So I think Mercedes have gone from that kind of that they acted like the first race was the worst thing that's ever happened, in the history of the racing team, and then it was clearly not what they wanted, and I think they've got their heads around a lot of things. So I think if anyone's underestimated it, I think that their PR, their spin around it has probably helped that. And I think Alonso and Sainz were both saying, weren't they, after Friday practice, they were like, this is not a car that's failing to get into Q3. It's still one of the quickest cars here. It's just obviously got, a few issues there. And I think that Mercedes actually, this race more than anything proved that if they can keep getting a handle on those issues. I mean, Lewis said he's still not happy with the car, didn't he, really? He said he's still not really feeling at one with it, which, if that suggests there's still even more to come from Lewis, then I think that's pretty encouraging. But yeah, I think it's a funny one. I think out of all the teams coming out of Bahrain, Mercedes seem to be, in real trouble. And now you would say that's not the case. Would you look at Ferrari, look at other teams? So it shows you perception's everything in Formula One. And Toto Wolff's very good at, he accentuates the good, but when it's bad as well, I love that about Toto. He just goes full on, this is terrible. I hate everything. We might as well leave the sport type thing, and then the next week it's like, hey, we're great. We're finishing second again. So if anyone has underestimated it, it's down to that, I think.
Well, the silver arrows appear to be pointing up, and we, on that note, are going to be right back. Welcoming us now is Toni Cowan-Brown. She's an F1 content creator and journalist. One of my favorite follows on social media at Toni Cowan-Brown. Toni, welcome. All right, give us those reactions. I know you've been chomping at the bit to discuss this. Let's go.
where do we start? You know what? I was actually listening to some of the post-race discussions, and I think Nico Hülkenberg, out of all of them, had the best description. He said it was wild, it was messy, and it was dynamic. And I was like, you know what, bud? You are on the nose with that one. I love this season so far, but I've loved we've got some great race battles at the top for the podium, but we've also got some incredible midfield battles right now. And I think we saw a lot of that. And I do think F1 gives us a great race when you know that you're spending more time looking at the midfield battle than what's happening at the top three. But truly, this is one of those races that gave us everything, both the good, the bad, and the very complicated, I would say.
Well, let's talk about those midfield battles. There's two teams in particular that I know you want to highlight. McLaren versus Haas. Lots of personalities in both of those paddocks. So obviously McLaren ends with a favorable finish here. I don't know if it was necessarily one we need to congratulate, since there were retirements that created the situation. But Haas also, a little bit lopsided in terms of how both of these drivers ran. What's your take?
I had a moment when I was watching the race going, wait, I can't believe that I'm watching the two McLarens battle out the two Haases. And I don't think anyone could have predicted that in the midfield. Obviously, that was until Magnussen got kicked out of the race and had the DNF. But I definitely had a moment of, this is both thrilling and both surreal and kind of weird. And one of those things that no one could have predicted, of watching both the McLarens and the Haases battle it out. And I think more than anything, I was very excited for the McLarens. Some pretty incredible overtaking from Lando. Very great to see Oscar end up in the points as well at his, some of his first Formula One points. So I know that that's always a big deal for any Formula One driver. And look, solid points for Nico Hülkenberg as well. There was something exciting for me of watching that battle again, because it's just one of those that you can't script out. So just some solid, I think what it highlighted for me, is just some solid driving right there. And I'm curious to see where this takes us. But more than anything, I did have a moment of scratching my head going, wait, is this really what I'm watching? Two McLarens and two Haases battling it out? Wow.
It does seem, though, that the driving from McLaren has been more consistent from both drivers.
Yes. And I think, look, that's the big conversation, and we're seeing that also with the Alpine drivers as well. Like, that is always the big conversation, and this sort of misunderstanding that there really is that moment where the driver has to figure out that car, where that moment where the driver is just like, okay, I can understand the car, I'm getting to grips with the car is not going to adapt fully to me at this point, it's my turn to adapt to the car. And I think we're definitely seeing that with Oscar Piastri and his McLaren, which is obviously the whole conversation that Daniel Ricciardo struggled with that McLaren last year. So I think it's great to see both a Lando and an Oscar finally getting to grips with that car, but also with the Alpine, watching Pierre Gasly, truly, that car was fast. And obviously those two definitely had a tough conversation to have after that race, after they both DNF'd. But watching Pierre clearly, third, fourth race in, going, okay, I'm starting to get a good understanding of this car, was exciting as well to see. Yeah.
It's interesting that you mentioned Alpine too, because heading into Jeddah, I applauded this team for their discipline, right? Yeah. To come out of Bahrain with the penalties and just kind of being a bit of a clown show, frankly. And then to go into Jeddah, have such good practices, have a great qualifying effort, and to finish, respectably at Jeddah. I was like, wow, this is a team that is pulling it together. They're staying disciplined. They're staying focused. They're not letting the noise or the narrative or the buzz that, especially on the heels of Drive to Survive being binged by everyone, all of the Piastri excess rate really get to them. And yet, I don't know if we want to say it was the red flag or something more, for all of that to sort of crumble literally in this effort is, I'm really disheartened by it, frankly.
And that's the brutality of Formula One, is there's a lot that's completely out of the hands of the drivers. But I will say this, you have to look at the drivers and the silly mistakes that a lot of them made in some of those restarts that wasn't entirely their fault. But there is a conversation, I think, that needs to be had there. And I will say, actually, interestingly, for Pierre Gasly, he was very lucky, because it is worth noting that he has 10 penalty points currently on his super license. And as a reminder, those 12, penalty points, the moment you hit 12, that triggers an automatic ban. So I think he was also very lucky that he escaped not receiving another 2 penalty points, and you get those for, unsportsmanlike behavior on track, because that would have automatically triggered him a ban, which wouldn't have been very great for his start on a new team as well. But it was interesting to see. They did a video, as a lot of drivers do these days, when they're both, I think, in the flight back or off to the next destination. It was interesting to see those 2 Alpine drivers side by side going, it was pretty obvious that this was a bit of a failure from both of their parts. But this is what we get when we have so many restarts as well on cold tires.
Well, you're mentioning tire temperature. I think that's a perfect segue to talk about the warming tires in Australia, and will they or won't they ban tire warmers? Talk about this, because this is definitely part of the grander strategy that doesn't really get discussed as much.
Look, this was, it really isn't. And it just is another example of the layers upon layers of strategies and small components in Formula One that I think you slowly discover as you get into the sport more and more. It was interesting through both the quali, but also the race and the qualifying, specifically watching the teams sort of try and understand the weather components and how the weather was changing and how they were going to keep their tires warm. And similar in the race, watching all the starts and the stops, and truly watching the drivers struggle to keep those tires warm was just an incredible reminder for me of just how much cold tires are not only the enemy of F1, but how hard it is for the drivers to keep them warm. And the reason this was top of mind for me is because for a handful of years now, F1 has wanted to ban tire warmers in the sport. And this isn't the first time we've had this conversation. The idea was to ban them in 2024. We've had the will they, won't they ban them. It looks like this is no longer going to be a thing, but we've started a couple of years ago sort of trying to get to a point where we could potentially ban the tire warmers. So I think, last year, we went from keeping the tire warmers to 70 degrees. We were going to decrease the temperatures of those tire warmers this year. We decided not to. We decided to, instead of decreasing the temperature to 50 degrees, decrease the amount of time that we can keep the tire warmers heated. So we're in a position right now.
My goodness.
What? Exactly. My goodness is the right term. And the reason why some people might ask, well, wait, why do we want to ban tire warmers in the first place? It is A, it's got to do with sustainability. B, it's got to they want to mirror more what's happening in road cars, and road cars don't, warm the tires. But I think what this weekend highlighted for us is the reality is we're probably not quite there yet. And I believe the thing to keep in mind is that post Silverstone, Pirelli are developing right now a tire that might not need to be heated as much as the current tires. And they're going to test these out again post Silverstone. And that's going to be the big decision making moment of, okay, has Pirelli developed a tire that we may not need tire warmers for in 2024? So that's the big thing to keep in mind. But truly, watching this GP this weekend in Australia, that was the one thing that kept going through my mind is these drivers' tires are not ready for, tires that are not pre-warmed before.
And the strategists, you could argue, maybe didn't have data that could help them, given what disruptive practices and a wet second practice. Yeah. And obviously in the third practice, teams are focused on quali. So there wasn't a ton of data, tire data specifically, that would allow the strategists to have a clear plan heading into the race. So it was just another added element, the unknowns added to this. So to end it though, are you pro or con tire warmer? I'm not quite sure where you stand.
I'm not sure. I think the sport has had so many changes in the next couple of years that I think it's been working right now. I think if it's going to lead to that amount of chaos, I actually prefer seeing the drivers not have to spend too much time struggling trying to warm their tires. That being said, there's a lot of other motorsport series that don't have the tire warmers. But there's another interesting hot topic, actually, if you really want to have a fun discussion with the friends this weekend, is it wasn't the Pirelli tender is up. So the FIA has just announced also that the Pirelli tender is up for debate again, looking at the 2025, 2027 season with a possibility to extend in 2028. And we didn't always have just one sole tire provider in Formula One. We had times where we had 5 tire providers. So that is, if you want to add another layer of strategy and another layer of confusion, that's another fun topic, is do we like the idea of having one sole tire provider in Formula One, or do we want to see the comeback of tire wars?
Well, I don't know if Pirelli is going to be able to bring warm tires, but Tony Cowan-Brown, you always bring the heat to every F1 conversation. Thank you so much for joining us. Spencer, you mentioned that Max isn't very likable. And sometimes people who have ice water running through their veins aren't very likable, right? Because they're, well, cold. But when you are cold and savage, you tend not to panic. And Max didn't panic at the top of either restart, frankly. He is always so composed. He trusts the speed of the car. He trusts his own instincts and ability. And, you know, he flew 10 seconds ahead after passing Lewis at lap 12. So what do let's talk about Red Bull, Max's dominance, and what I hinted to a little bit earlier in the episode about Checo's relationship with him, and maybe him wanting to make sure that he is the alpha all across the board. Spencer, let's start with you.
I mean, I said he wasn't likable. Everything you need to like is in the car and the driving right now. It's ruthless. It's efficient when he makes mistakes. And he did. Like, if you want to know a notable thing about Max Verstappen this race, it's that we got to see him be human in the year 2023, which is a rarity. He did go off at one point, just on a wild oversteer. He and I don't blame him for losing attention, because that's happened sometimes when you're, when you're just vibing out front. Sometimes, your focus might lapse for a nanosecond. And if that happens, you go off. He still saved it, still finished, still won. Didn't have a great restart at one point. But all he needs right now is in the track. That's everything you can ask for as a driver, right? And that includes his team, which, yes, I'm sure there is some tension between Checo and Verstappen, because at any point in any race, Sergio Perez is more than capable of winning. He really is. We talk about drivers who are close. That man had an amazing race, low key. Like, if you look at everyone else in terms of his overtakes, in terms of the amount of ground that Perez gained at times during this race, he did have, I think, a good race. Maybe not the race he wanted, but I think he ended up having a good race given what he had. But Verstappen is so clearly a notch above him right now that, like, the comfort there, that will make up for any amount of friction between the drivers and me saying on the internet that he's not outwardly likable. I think that's fine, because everything else is 100% red line and awesome.
Nate, do you agree that Checo had that good of a race? I'm just going to mention that he started 20th, right? He ended 5th, but it took 8 cars to DNF for that to happen. And Stroll was holding him off. I mean, there was that, it was like, I think Gasly was 5th and Stroll was 6th. And I was like, Stroll might be the only driver who's going to keep Checo from moving into the top 5. I tweeted that, and I don't know. I have to say, yes, Checo was incredible in moments. But after watching Max move from 15th to 2nd, and knowing the expectations that the Red Bull team has of their drivers, do you think that his drive did indeed earn an A?
Yeah, I've got to say, I didn't think it was an A drive. I thought he's equipped with the fastest car. And it's a tricky place to overtake Melbourne, as he found. But he got stuck behind Norris for a few laps, and I just felt, I think if you'd swap the drivers around in those cars, if you put Max starting where he did, I would have still thought Max finishes on the podium. Maybe not wins the race, but just with what Max is able to do lap after lap. And I think that is the key difference between the two. Perez, obviously, Saturday was pretty rough for him. I really hoped that coming out of Jeddah, it was like, right, he's got the win. He's got that motivation. He's got it early in the season before Max is 50, 100 points down the road. Can he come into Melbourne and make it work? and boom, it just gets away from him straight away. So I wasn't super impressed. I mean, I'm always a bit skeptical when I saw so many drives where Lewis would come through the field, when he had the dominant car, and you see it sometimes with the quickest car versus even a midfield car, even a good midfield car. The difference in speed, especially when they have DRS, is crazy. So I felt like Perez could have made more ground. And like you said, Liz, there were a lot of retirements as well to kind of get him up the order there as well. Just on Verstappen quickly, that I think is really interesting about him. There has been one notable change with him in terms of his mindset, which comes from this confidence. That move where Lewis barged him out the way on turn 1, I think that was on the line. I think that was fair that wasn't a penalty, but I can see why Max was annoyed. But I think the fact that Max gave Lewis space like that shows you that he knows he turns up every race weekend, he's going to win the race. I think he knows he's got the measure of Perez. I think he knows he's got the car that should win most races, even in pretty tough situations. And like you said, Liz, even if it's 15th on the grid in Jeddah, he can come back to second. And I think a lot of that confidence comes from how he feels about, Checo. I think Checo can beat him once every 5 races. And I think the problem is we don't see it every single race. So Max is just in this place right now where he's just driving on another level. And it's always a cascade effect. People will have this debate forever. Is it the car? Is it the driver? A lot of people say, it's just the driver when someone dominates. But what you always see happen is both things go together. You have an incredible car, and then you have a great driver who gets more and more confident the more they win, and more sure of themselves, not just their own talent, but the ability of the car. And Max now, every weekend, he can turn up and he knows, in theory, he could win every race from now to the end of the season. He probably won't, but he could. And that is a crazy mindset to go into when you're also as good as Max Verstappen is. So I feel like he's just at this point right now where it's going to take a huge amount to knock his confidence. And I was kind of hoping Perez could maybe dent that with a drive. Obviously, it was never going to happen from 18th, but I don't think Max is going to be looking at that and thinking, I've got any real threat from Perez this season in terms of the championship, which is a shame. Maybe I'm wrong, but we've had 2 years now of just hoping Perez can get more out of the car, and we just haven't seen it.
And yet there still seems to be tension. But I think that, we talked about the competitive nature of athletes, competitors, period, right? It's something that needs to happen. We have to give Max his kudos. You did a wonderful job of doing that. But for history's sake, Verstappen now ties Senna for career podiums 80. There was a little bit of controversy, even more, in fact, after the race. And maybe it's because we talked about grid boxes ad nauseum at Jeddah, but here's a tweet. Do you think he lined up correctly, Max did, on the final restart? Spencer, do you make anything of this, or is this just, the internet being the internet?
Is this our point of emphasis for officials this year, is lining up correctly? I fail to be super moved by that. I know they have to be precise about that. No, like, is that really where we're at? Where we go? Did Verstappen line up correctly? Would it matter? Do you want him to line up a foot back? Do you want him to take 3?
I think he should start a lap down every race. I think that would be much more fair.
At this point, every mistake he makes is a heat check. That's really what we're talking about. The concept of putting up a shot just to see if you can save it. When he went off in this race and made that little mistake, I thought, I don't know, man. Did he do that on purpose? Just like, I don't know. Here, it's like boring. I'm so far ahead of everyone. No, I'm not particularly moved by that. If you want to give him a penalty, he'll overcome it. You are watching something special. And I think we need to acknowledge that in real time. You're seeing a guy who is reaching, as Nate said, peak confidence. It's only building from here. He's pulling further away from his teammate. And you're seeing something that, we need to realize, which at the time, this is spectacular. Like, this is something, I know that week to week, in order to find something interesting to talk about, we have to look further down and find some controversies, and we should, because they're there to see and they're cool. Overall, though, you're seeing a triumphant performance extended into year 2 at this level of dominance, and maybe even getting better.
And yet we're greedy, Spencer. We want more. We want so much more. Nate, to that point, can Red Bull get even faster?
I think they can. And that's always, and this was always the thing, to use, previous years' examples. When Mercedes were in front, we heard the same things from Red Bull and Ferrari that we're hearing now from Mercedes and Ferrari, that yes, we can catch them. We're behind now, but just give us one upgrade, we can get there. Mercedes aren't the only team upgrading. Ferrari aren't the only team bringing upgrades. Aston aren't the only team bringing upgrades. Red Bull are so good at doing that historically, and I think they're also at a point where they're kind of understanding this car. So I think sadly they can get a lot faster. The hope is always that basically their development curve will end a lot sooner than everybody else's. Everyone else has more to find, in theory. But I remember saying that for about 4 years with Mercedes, and they kept finding more. So again, I think they can get better. On the grid slot thing, just to go back to that, Liz, they have sensors on the grid now anyway. So I love that we've now got basically a lot of internet detectives on Reddit who will look at every little thing. But I'm pretty sure that the sensors would have picked up that Max was on there. He was on there but it would have picked it up. And that's why it's so important they line up within those things like Alonso in Saudi, because if you're outside of that, the sensor doesn't pick you up and effectively doesn't think you're on the grid at all. So as much as people want to look at it and say, I can tell from this picture it's on, if the computer's telling race control he's in. But it made, I mean, I saw it, and I have to say, I was kind of zooming in as much as I can. I was, doing the zoom on the phone, but I think he just about got away with it. But that would have topped off the drama if he'd then had something post-race. So I feel like the FIA must be just like so relieved that didn't happen, because I wouldn't have envied that position at all if they had to say, sorry, Max, but we've got to give you a penalty now for this tiny infraction.
From grid boxes to gravel to red flags to rocket ships, basically this Australian Grand Prix elicited a lot of conversation, but not just among fans and analysts, also from the drivers. Here are some best post-race comments.
I don't have anything to say. I'm just extremely disappointed.
Right now I cannot talk. I'm too angry, too disappointed,
Yeah, just extremely frustrating. I mean, it's the worst start to the season ever, really.
Pretty disappointed initially with the decision to red flag the race.
We lucked out with the timing of the red flags, so take it, some good points.
Oh my God, it was really super exciting and really unfortunate for George because he was doing such a great job. But to have a great battle with Fernando was really awesome.
It was not an easy race. I think matching the pace of Mercedes was not easy. Also Ferrari and Alpine, they were putting some pressure behind me. So I tried to force a mistake from Luis all race long, tried to get close, but he drove fantastically well as a champion he is.
Yeah, it was very chaotic today, a bit of a mess to be honest. Especially the second red flag, I think that was really unnecessary today. That could have easily been solved with a virtual safety car or a safety car at most. But yeah,
it's the most unfair penalty I've seen in my life. So I will go first to Stewards and then come by. I just need to come to a TV pen because if I don't come, they put me another penalty. So.
Up until that point, though,
I prefer not to talk.
I just have no comment for now, and I'm way too disappointed to be standing here and looking these guys doing one lap.
Can I ask you about?
I'm fine. Sorry.
Let's talk about Ferrari, guys. The stable of horses is having some issues here. Charles Leclerc out at the start of the race. His bad luck continues. How bad do we feel for him, Spencer? Or do you just sort of think like, what a mistake? Like that was a blatant mistake. You can't really do it. This wasn't a reliability issue, which is what we've been saying about Ferrari. This was a driver error.
It was driver error, and yet I still feel bad for him. I'm still going to feel bad for a driver when they make a mistake like that, particularly if it's a driver who's been snake bitten in so many other ways. This just feels like one more turn of the wheel for him in terms of misfortune. I think it's good at this point. If you want to go ahead and bright side what is otherwise a miserable day for Charles Leclerc, get it out of the way early. That's it. Like, we're still very early in the season. Right? We're at race number 3. Let's go ahead and just get the bad stuff out of the way so that you can go ahead and focus. Additionally, maybe getting it out of the way early in this race in particular was a good thing because things certainly didn't clear up later and only got worse. So if you're going to have a bad day, I don't know, front load it. Go ahead and front load it. And Ferrari in general had a real kneecapper of a day overall. I don't think this is the end for Charles Leclerc, but I do know this. We're going to find out exactly how mentally tough he is. That's it. We're going to find out. Like, I think we already know that he's capable of going through some serious strife in terms of on-track and off-track drama when it comes to his race team. This is yet just another test. If he wins anything this season, it'll be earned.
I think the frustration for Charles...
Nate, that was what I wanted to ask you, having covered Charles for so long. How do you think mentally he's going to handle this?
Yeah, and I think we will see what he's made of. I think this year is a bit different for him compared to last season, and the frustrations there, because I think last year Charles came into the season convinced I can win the title in 2022. That was in his mind from the very, very, very start. So every time something like this happened, whether it was a strategy error, whether it was the mistake in France, it was, oh man, I'm not going to win the championship like I thought. I think Charles knew pretty soon this year he wasn't going to win the championship. So it's clearly still frustrating for him, but I think now it's gone from, almost heartbreak, almost, just almost that. It's a much different sense of frustration. This year it's frustration because he's like, how have we taken such a step back? And then this was nothing to do with car performance. It was nothing to do with strategy. It was just a racing incident on lap one. It was just something that, that could happen to anyone. So I think the frustration feels different for him this year. I think the key is going to be that when Ferrari is in a position to have a clean race, he mentally needs to be in the right place to utilize, to put the car where it needs to be. Charles always been a bit up and down like that. He's very, very hard on himself, and I'm curious to see whether that will be something in Baku, whether he's like, I've just not been good enough, that it's all down to me or whatever it is. So we'll see. And Charles, I think the problem with Charles as well is that there are so many photos going around of him on the internet of him just looking so sad. I mean, like beyond levels of sad I've ever seen in even a puppy. When you see like a real like a just really miserable animal outside, like he's looked proper grumpy a lot of times this year. So I think that's added to the just general sense that fans have, that like almost wanting to just put an arm around Charles and say, it'll be all right, man. You're still driving for Ferrari, still Formula One driver, living in Monte Carlo. Like, things will come good eventually.
Yeah.
Like, and I think that's the thing for him right now, is that we know he's good enough that when that car's in a good position, he can challenge for championship. He just needs to make sure that at the moment, he knows that's not going to be in 2023. Just ride this wave, and hopefully next year, he's back in a good car. And he's almost, a lot of drivers have said it's the tough years, and not just drivers, across sports. I mean, Michael Jordan said this all the time, didn't he? It's the tough moments that make you in the great moments. It's how you learn from those moments. It's how you get a lot better. I don't think this is as low as Charles will have felt over the last 2 years. I think he had much lower moments last year. So it's just making sure you're not just completely thinking like, I've got no luck whatsoever. But I think he'll be okay. Hopefully, if he keeps having races like this, then I'll think otherwise. But hopefully he can kind of appreciate, in terms of context, a little bit different to last season. But it's a long way to fly, isn't it? Just to be knocked out of the race. What was it? 2 corners in? 2 corners? 3 corners?
Mm-hmm.
That's a long journey. So that, I think, more than anything on the ride back, he's going to be thinking about that.
Well, the broadcasting crew called Charles the decimated figure. Look at his decimated figure walking back to the paddock. And yet, Spencer talked about this earlier. That was not much compared to Carlos Sainz's reaction after receiving the penalty, the 5-second penalty after the second red flag. I want to talk about this a little bit, because we're talking about, there's a long break here. And Nate, you talked earlier about how sometimes it's best just to get back in the car, right? When we were discussing Alpine. But I have to imagine like this lingering feeling between races is not beneficial to the team overall. And Spencer, what do you make of this massive blow for the team as a total? And for Sainz in particular, frankly, I had him finishing third at the last race in Jeddah, and he underwhelmed there. And then to be hit with this at the end, I thought he might be relieved. And then, it all fell apart. So Ferrari has got to be at a low and just kind of waiting in it until the next race.
Well, the best thing for team morale is for everybody to be happy or everybody to be miserable. That's it.
Company.
And the one positive outcome for Ferrari out of this is that everyone's miserable. Everyone had something bad happen to them. They can all agree that they are on the same footing. We don't have this sort of deep insecurity between outcomes, right? It's not like Carlos Sainz was second and received the best tire strategy, and Leclerc bottomed out in lap 34 thanks to mismanagement by the team. In that sense, it's improvement for Ferrari. So if everyone's miserable, at least you have a common place to start over this long break. I think if there's 2 things at play here, this race is so far away and there is so much space around it that you have time to just leave it as a bad thing that we forget. That's it, right? Yes, sometimes it is good to get back in the car. Sometimes it is also good to go, okay, remember that race on the other side of the world where a bunch of weird things happened? Just didn't happen. Shh, it's fine. It's fine. We'll go back to Monaco. We'll have some espresso. We'll eat something delicious and expensive. We'll figure it out. That
maybe light.
Yeah.
Light some sage, cleanse
Sure.
the area, get yourself a nice rose quartz crystal, just zhuzh it up.
Yeah, consider this. If we're talking about the Ferrari narrative, okay? Given what it was last year, and Nate is so important in terms of putting struggle in context, what kind of a fight are we going in? We're not really fighting with ourselves. I don't see that in this race. I don't see Ferrari as engaged in a war with itself organizationally over the course of the race, right? They're not the
absolutely.
problem. And that's a positive, okay? When you have as much investment, as much talent, and the time now in between this race and Baku, there's some positives. It's not all bad.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think everything going on at the moment with Ferrari, I know we know what the issues are with their car, and obviously Vasseur's gone in there. It's going to take a while to change culture behind the scenes, but what the drivers are saying about that has been positive. They're kind of happy with what they've seen so far behind the scenes. Maybe they're not so happy with where things are on track, but yeah, I felt like Sainz really needed that today. Yeah. I think a good result, because I was the same as you, Liz. I was really underwhelmed by him in Jeddah, and he, by his own admission, hasn't been good enough, in those first two races. And you could just feel, couldn't you, just how that was complete despair at the end.
Yeah.
And I think at one point, he says, I don't deserve to be out of the points in this race. That's where his mind was at. Quick one on that really did baffle me. And we talked about new fans earlier. It's a strange one, a difficult one to explain to fans, how you can have a restart. A few people crash out. You can effectively delete that lap and say the only thing that does count from that lap is the penalty that Sainz got, because effectively the rest of that was wiped out. So I think if you're Sainz, you're looking at that and saying, well, how come everyone else has basically got away with that, and yet I have to have a penalty? And I know that isn't the rules. They did follow the rules correctly, but you can understand why he's in that position and frustrated. So Ferrari at the moment just have no luck, but at least they're having this bad luck now when they're not winning. This would be worse if we were seeing them again like last year, falling apart. So hopefully 3 weeks, those guys can just, like Spencer said, I mean, these guys live in a pretty great part of the world. I'm sure they can get away, get back to training, get back to focusing. Hopefully Baku, we see some good luck. I feel like they've deserved it at this point. Like, it's been a long time coming.
All right, so we're gonna sage the paddock. We're gonna sage the garage. Charles is gonna get some espresso and a pastry of some sort, and Carlos will play some pickleball in Malaga, and we'll pick back up.
Yeah, or some chess. He's a big chess fan.
Oh, yeah.
So maybe that's his secret.
I love that for him. Which teams will make the biggest steps forward during this break, particularly, as you noted, how difficult these, quote, midfield teams are to rank? Spencer, you're nodding. Go ahead.
I'm going to go ahead and say that if we're looking to who's going to make the biggest progress over the next 3 weeks, I sort of set this up earlier. I think it's Ferrari. I think Ferrari, if they do things right and they just put all of this dysfunction behind them, can have an outstanding finish in Baku.
Yeah, Ferrari's a good call. I'd say McLaren will certainly hope it's them, given where they're at, given the resources they have, given the fact that Aston have kind of embarrassed a few of those teams around them. I think they really need a big break before Baku.
I'm going to ask you about McLaren, because I love the point that Spencer made about them not really finishing in the points, but ultimately finishing in the points. What's your take on Norris and Piastri really quickly? Because, there was a lot of talk, obviously, about Danny Ricciardo because we were just in Australia. But I am interested in a little McLaren analysis here, whether this car is so bad and Norris has done just such an admirable job with it, whether Piastri this is his base level. He just knows a bad car at the F1 level. What does that mean for his overall progress as a young rookie driver? Give me a quick, let's dig a little bit here, McLaren.
Yeah, I've been impressed with Piastri, actually. I know he's not got the car to really have great results, but you can see that the talent is there that Zach Brown said is there. And I think that one of the interesting things was last year McLaren spent so long worrying about how do we get form out of Daniel Ricciardo. I think it was very easy to say, well, the problem is Ricciardo's not in form. And they could overlook the fact that they hadn't built a great car. I think this year it's much more obvious. You've got two drivers who clearly are performing quite well, and you're like, well, look how bad that car is compared to the rest. So I think in a weird way, McLaren have given themselves a really good baseline, and they can kind of work out, right, here's where we need to improve. But yeah, Piastri's been good. And I think that there was so much talk, wasn't there, about how he came in. I'm glad that he hasn't just completely, shown us nothing. There's been signs. So I think if McLaren can get their head around the car, I think I could still see them kind of fighting with Alpine like they did last year, but they need that to happen quickly, I think. I mean, Spencer, what do you reckon?
I believe at this point the car is pretty much the car. So the best that McLaren can do is marginally improve that. That's just based on what I've seen in 3 races. They have improved. I don't think that they're as rock bottom as they looked earlier. But ultimately what you're talking about, you have 2 assignments here in terms of driver development, right? You have to go ahead and remind Lando Norris that he's awesome. That's what you have to do. You have to say a bunch of very, very nice things to him. And additionally, what you have to do with Piastri is gently encourage. You don't want him to get too far ahead of his curve. But you're right. He's been very promising. He's done really well in his first year with McLaren. They have 2 different tracks, and managerially, I think it's always a challenge to manage 2 drivers and their expectations. It's especially a challenge when you're doing that against the car. When you're doing that against the car and you say, okay, guys, it's going to be this good. And we're just going to hope to get it to this. And if you can see, my hand is going up just a little, not a lot.
Yeah, that's a tough sell. It's a tough sell.
Drivers are united because their car, they know, is subpar. There are not a bunch of united drivers necessarily in this grid. And we love, as fans, rivalries between drivers. So which team will face a heated driver rivalry first? Spencer, Mercedes, Red Bull, or Ferrari potentially?
Ferrari, I think they have a collective enemy in terms of fate. They're all unified against bad luck at this point, so I don't think they have to turn internally for enemies. Mercedes, I think, has the more long-term issue of who do we build around? What's the future look like? Lewis is not getting any younger, and George Russell is not becoming any less impressive down the road. So I think they have the bigger long-term issue. Ferrari has the short-term issue of a very good driver who, I agree with Nate, is clearly not as elite, not as great as the great driver who is setting records and doing things that no one has done either in a really long time or ever in Max Verstappen. I think they have the more immediate issue with friction between Checo and Verstappen because they can run so close, because the car is so good, and because at times they can be right on each other. I think that's the more immediate problem.
It's a really good question, isn't it? Because there are so many across the grid. I think Ferrari, I don't think there's a big chance of that happening. I think Charles and Carlos really do genuinely get on. You can tell that. Similar ages, they seem to have very similar personalities. I feel like there is something brewing at Mercedes, but I don't know. Toto Wolff's dealt with this before. So if it was out of the top 3, I'd probably pick Mercedes. But if we're going outside the top 3, we saw it, didn't we? Alpine has got nightmare written all over it. So I'm going to go outside those top 3 and pick Alpine. But if it's out of those top 3, probably Mercedes, just given how close those 2 guys are. But both the team bosses of those teams must be looking at it thinking like, this is going to get tricky later in the year, I think.
Do you think that the potential friction at Red Bull could lead to a Danny Ricciardo sighting on the grid towards the end of the season? That was my bold take heading into the year. And it was only intensified as we're in Australia. And he's like, I think I might want to go back to the grid. And I was like, well, if Checo does the wrong thing, you might be. Because there's no way Max is threatened by Danny Ricciardo. He would love it, right?
When he's saying all the right things now, isn't he, Daniel? He's suddenly saying, I do want to be back. And his demeanor has completely changed. I mean, we spoke to him on Unlapped in New York at the launch of the car. And you could tell the difference from him then to, say, Austin, when he was just like, I just want to finish. I just want to leave this team. I just want to get away from the grid. He's completely changed. So I think it was interesting, wasn't it? Horner said he's doing things as a driver we didn't recognize from him before. And you get the impression that if they can get those things out of his system, then maybe he suddenly is a viable number 2 driver for them. But I think it'd be fascinating. I think Perez, that's one of the things hanging over his head, but he's going to have to do something pretty bad, I think, to lose that seat, because it does seem like it's his. But I would love Danny Rick back in the car, so let's see how that plays out.
I have one more flyer I'd like to take, because today's competitive balance is tomorrow's friction. Aston Martin. At one point down the road, because everyone's getting along so spectacularly, I will just instantly counter that and bet on Fernando Alonso becoming his usual cranky self at one point down the road. It's just, he's too good at it. He's too good at it. I don't want to take the man out of his element. At one point, there's going to be a little tiff between the 2 of them.
And there is a timeline somewhere. Sorry, Liz. There is a timeline somewhere where Stroll went straight into the back of Alonso on that opening lap in Bahrain. And I feel like in that timeline, it's already fallen apart. Alonso's left the team. Lawrence Stroll has just said, I'm done with Formula One. I don't want to do it anymore. The whole thing's fallen apart. And luckily that didn't happen. So I think you're right. But I think Alonso knows he's got to play the long game there. You don't piss off the dad of your teammate if your dad is the owner of the team. He's the guy paying the checks. So I feel like that alone will stop Alonso. He knows this is it for him. It's this or retire without another championship. So I think that's enough of a motivation. But I agree with you. I think we'll get cranky Alonso, but we'll get diplomatic or barrister Alonso, as you said. He'll be smarter about it.
The Nepo baby factor has to be mentioned. But yes, what a way to end it. Talking about barrister Alonso. That's a perfect way. Last question for you guys. Which Grand Prix are you most looking forward to?
Oh, that's a great question. I'm not just saying this because we're on an ESPN pod, but I'm looking forward to Miami to see if last year's race was super, super dull just because it was the first race there, or if we can actually get a great race at that venue. They've made a few changes. The paddock looks great. And I'm just curious to see if they've made little tweaks here and there, if that can actually improve the racing. Because if it can't, the evidence is maybe that's not the best circuit going forward. But I'm always an optimist, and I love the fake marina as well. So, bring that on. Loved it.
Yeah, but listen, there's some excellent catering on those boats in the fake marina, so be sure to get you some of that next time you're around. I am a very short-term person. I'm looking forward to Baku just because I am so into and compelled by the storylines of improvement. What are we seeing? Who's coming along? We have so much competition from like the 6 to the 2 spot in terms of teams figuring things out, that the next data point is the most interesting for me. Also, I love that course. It's just the coolest setting.
It's just nuts, isn't it?
It's nuts.
Complete nuts.
It's nuts. It's to me like that and Vegas are the 2 tracks where I was like, how do you even do this? How do you even make this happen? So I'm looking forward to Baku. Always do.
And Vegas as well. Obviously.
I was just about to say the F1 fangirl in me, and I don't mind embracing that title. And and my love of sequins is very excited for Vegas. But I'm also, as a fan of the sport, really interested in Imola because of the upgrades that will take place, particularly for Mercedes at that race. So I want to see if we're talking about how much more progress can Mercedes make, and can they potentially close the gap between Red Bull. Imola, I think, is going to be an interesting race for those purposes. All right, we're going to end with our way too early season predictions. Top 3 in drivers, top 3 in constructors. Nate, you go first.
So I'm going to go out on a limb here and say I think Verstappen's going to win the championship. I think, sorry, Spencer, if you had that, if that brave call as well. I think I'm going to put, this is difficult because I think Perez deserves to be in here, but I'm going to can I put Alonso / Hamilton second and Perez third? I'm going to do that. Actually, let's just say Alonso. I've backed Alonso all season. I'll say Verstappen, Alonso, Hamilton, and then Red Bull, Mercedes, Aston. I think Alonso's going to do enough on the driver's side alone. He's going to rack points up all season. He might as well own that 3rd position at this point. That's going to be his, I think, throughout the year. So I think that would be mine. But I've been proven wrong on those a lot. So, they're not gospel by any means.
Very hard to pick anybody but Verstappen for a driver's championship. In second, I'm going to go ahead and I'll live dangerously. I'll say Hamilton. I'm just going to go ahead and say Hamilton outright in second. And then I'll say in third, Alonso. And I think that's just because if I have somebody behind me, the most threatened I will feel at any point in a realistic universe where Max Verstappen is not in front of me, the most threatened I'm going to feel is by Alonso. The way that he games out against the driver ahead of him in a competitive car, it's just not a place you want to be, right? So he is, like, to me, the most compelling second place driver that we have. In terms of constructors, it's obviously, I think it's going to be Red Bull, Mercedes, Aston. With Aston being the MVP there, if you go like from the journey of how far you went from where you were to where you are, in a sense, that 3rd place is going to be a 1st place for them because this is everything that they want and could reasonably want out of the season.
And there's going to be where the gap between Alonso and Stroll gets interesting because I think Mercedes realistically will fill that gap. So in terms of points, they're probably going to start outscoring Aston, you would think. Yeah. Maybe I'm misjudging Stroll. Maybe I'm writing him off when I shouldn't be. But I feel like that is how that will play out.
Well, that's the point, right? Because it feels like Fernando and Lewis are pretty evenly matched, but George Russell is a better driver than Lance Stroll, which would give the edge, particularly in the constructors, to Mercedes. So Red Bull, Mercedes, Aston, Max, Fernando, Lewis, Russell, really close. 3-4, very close. But I think we're all pretty much in lockstep. What a ride. That is going to do it for us today. Thanks for listening. Be sure to like and follow ESPN F1 for more content. Leave your comments below, positive ones, please. And make sure to listen to the Unlapped podcast every single week.